Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Michael Bellacosa, Community Engagement Manager at Walton Library. I'm very happy to welcome you to tonight's program. It's, I think, the second one we've done with Go Green this year. We had one about a month ago. It was really great. I know they're working on another one for the fall with us, and keep your eyes open for that. We and they will, I'm sure, announce it once we've got all the details worked out. It's a great topic, and I'm sure you're going to learn a lot. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our friends from Go Green to introduce the speaker on the program.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you so much to the Wilton Library for partnering with Wilton Go Green on tonight's program. Before I launch into the introduction, I just wanted to remind everybody that the chat feature is turned off. So if anybody has questions at any time during the presentation, feel free to type them into the Q&A section. It is my honor to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Jonathan Foley is a world-renowned environmental scientist, sustainability expert, author, and educator. He earned his PhD in atmospheric sciences at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he has focused his expertise on developing novel solutions to respond to our changing climate and to sustain ecosystems and natural resources on which we all depend. His research has been published in prestigious scholarly journals, such as the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Foley's research and insights have garnered the trust of governments, foundations, and business leaders around the world. He currently serves as Executive Director of Project Drawdown, the world's leading resource for climate solutions. Without further ado, it is my delight to introduce Dr. Jonathan Foley.
Well, thank you all, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with you tonight to talk about climate change and climate solutions. So I'm going to just share a little presentation here over the webinar, and then we'll have some time for Q&A towards the end. But tonight we're going to talk about climate change, but we're going to talk about it in a more hopeful way than I hope maybe you've heard before, but also really sticking to the science and show how it is actually possible for us to address climate change and stop global warming before it gets really out of control in the later century. But as we begin any sort of discussion of the future, sometimes it's helpful to kind of understand where we came from and look at our recent past and understand how we got into this mess in the first place. Humanity has always been affecting the environment. Even our ancient ancestors, millions of years ago, were affecting the environment around them by hunting and gathering, by inventing fire, and later inventing agriculture and settlements and so on. But it's really kind of the 20th century version of humanity that started to really drastically change the environment at a global scale. First of all, we became far more numerous in the 20th century, especially the last 50 years. We also transitioned to becoming, for the first time in human history, a largely urban population. But the truly tremendous growth of a first in history global economy, fueled by technology, accelerating beyond belief in the last few decades, driving up consumption, driving up energy use, and so on. These factors, plus some others, have really kind of woven together to change our relationship to the planet dramatically in the last few decades. In fact, in the last 50 years, the population of our planet about doubled, but the economy grew almost sixfold during the same time. And because of that, mostly because of the resource consumption and economic growth, we've seen about a tripling of global food demand, a doubling roughly of global water use, and a near tripling of global fossil fuel combustion. And stop and think about it for a second. We've changed more in the last 50 years than we did in the previous 6 million years of hominid evolution and all of human history combined. So we're living in a really interesting time where everything is changing. Even the way we're changing is changing right now. This new relationship with the planet, though, is disrupting systems globally. We're no longer confining our environmental impact to right around where we live, or just the pollution from a plant or from a city or a car. It's global now. We're undermining global environmental systems. Some of those changes are obvious. Some of them we can see very plainly with our eyes right in front of us. For example, deforestation. When we clear cut forest around the world, we can see it on the ground. And now we're doing so much of it, we can see changes even from space. This shows a pair of images from a remote part of the Amazon starting in the 1970s and showing widespread clearing as early as 2003, mainly here to grow soybeans as animal feed, most of which are being shipped to China to increase global pork production. But so far, we've seen about 30% of the world's tropical forest is lost, a lot of that in the last few decades. And that we can see from space, from the ground, and there's really no arguing with that. We humans have also been altering water resources globally, whether it's the Colorado River no longer flowing to the ocean, overdrafting the Ogallala Aquifer in the US, or decline of snowpack, and so on. But this one kind of takes the prize of being the most visible change in water resources because we overdrafted a water supply. This is the former Aral Sea. What used to be a large inland sea in Central Asia has basically disappeared. During the Soviet era, the Soviet Union started to dam up the rivers that fed the Aral Sea and diverted them eastward to irrigate the Kazakh desert to grow more cotton. And it basically destroyed the water supply of the Aral Sea, and what's left is now just a barren desert for the most part. Water resources, like forest, are changing all over the world because we're over-consuming things faster than nature can regenerate them. We're kind of depleting our world of forest, of fish, of water, and so on through this massive overconsumption. But we're also changing the planet in ways that are actually a little bit more subtle too. And here I'm going to be talking about climate change. Climate change is not so subtle today, but for the last few decades, we were still kind of arguing. Not the scientists, we knew, but other folks were sort of arguing whether or not climate change was really happening or not, or whether it was that important or not, and so on. But now the debate is over, and we know for a fact that we have been changing the Earth's climate, and we're only just beginning to, unless we change our ways. The reason for this, you've all heard before, is that we humans have been increasing some levels of gases, including carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere. CO2 levels have increased by about 50%. Methane levels have increased 2.5 times. So other greenhouse gases have increased even more. But during this time that we've been adding pollution to the atmosphere, which is building up its ability to trap heat and warm the planet, we've seen that the planet has indeed warmed, very much in line with this expectation. The Earth has warmed a little over now, a tad over 1 degree Celsius. That may not sound like a lot, but we're talking about the temperature of the entire planet, which doesn't fluctuate all that much at all. During the last ice age, in fact, the Earth was only about 3, 4, 5 degrees colder than normal. We're already 1 degree warmer than normal, and we're heading towards a lot more than that unless we change our behavior. This is now the warmest our planet has been in several million years, certainly during all of human existence, and it's shooting upward. I start this graph, by the way, in the 1850s. You might find this interesting, is because that's when the first science that proposed something like a greenhouse effect and that increasing greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide could warm the planet. It used to be, I used to think, because that's what I was told in grad school, that the first scientist to do this was a British scientist by the name of Joseph Tyndall. But it turns out that's not true. A few years before he published his paper in the 1860s, an American woman named Eunice Foote actually published the first paper in 1856, speculating that increasing CO2 levels in the atmosphere would warm the planet. So actually it was an American woman, Eunice Foote, F-O-O-T-E, who was really ignored for far too long, was really the pioneer who first proposed the idea of climate change from human activities. She was also a leader in the suffrage movement to give women the vote in America. She was a signer of the Seneca Falls Declaration and really is kind of a heroine of American science history, but it was forgotten for far too long. So let's try to remember her when we can. But now we see all of these changes transforming the planet, whether it's the changes in our waters, our lands, our atmosphere, our climate, etc. And I wouldn't blame you a bit if you look at this, what I just showed you, and say, wow, that's kind of grim. There's a lot of things that look like they're heading in the wrong direction. And some people might jump to the conclusion that it's hopeless, that there's nothing we can do about it, that it's just we're destined to have a depleted and degraded world for us and future generations. But that's not true. We can still change the future. The future is not written yet, and we can still build a better one than the path we're headed towards right now. we can still build a future where people and nature can both thrive to get together today and tomorrow. And in order to do that, though, we do have to address climate change because it's one of the more crucial issues facing us in the 21st century. Now, climate change is so important, not just as an environmental problem, it's important to like almost everything else we care about. Climate also underpins our water, our food, our air, our health, our security, our economy, all of these things. So if we want a prosperous future, we want a safe and healthy future, we want a future with justice and equity, we have to think about climate change too, because it kind of touches everything we do. So that's why I work for a place called Project Drawdown. We're a nonprofit organization that's made up mostly of scientists and analysts and also writers and communicators. And we're the world's leading resource for climate solutions. We're all about what can we do about climate change and how do we get it started? Well, why do we use the word drawdown, by the way? Well, drawdown refers to this. Right now, the level of greenhouse gases, the things that are warming the planet, have been just going up and up and up. The higher that curve goes, the warmer the planet gets and the more destabilized our environment will be. So we don't want to see it go higher because that would be very, very bad. Instead, just like with the pandemic, we want to bend the curve, bend it down back into a safer place. And when we finally begin to do that, when we stabilize the level of greenhouse gases and then slowly bring them back down again, that will be the moment of drawdown. It's the moment when the levels of greenhouse gases stop climbing and they start to steadily decline. And that's the moment we stop future changes in climate. So how do we get there? How do we get to that point of drawdown, stopping climate change before it gets much worse? Well, to do that, we have to understand what we're talking about. Greenhouse gases include several different things. We hear a lot about carbon dioxide, CO2, which is mostly, but not entirely, coming from fossil fuels. But we also have to consider things like methane, another important greenhouse gas that comes from industry, but also agriculture. We have to include another one called nitrous oxide, N2O, that comes from mainly overusing fertilizers, plus a little bit in industry, and some other chemicals like fluorinated gases and many, many others. When we look at these individually, we see they've all been increasing over time, and we've got to kind of hit that moment of drawdown for each and every one of these. To first order, a lot of climate change is being caused by burning of fossil fuels and CO2. So that is a very good place to focus a lot of our effort. But it turns out the warming we see right now for the next century or so, about 62% of that is caused by burning fossil fuels. It's the biggest part, but it's not the only part. It turns out some CO2 is also produced when we make cement and other industrial processes, just chemically release CO2 into the air without burning anything. We also have CO2 emitted into the air when we burn down rainforest, like in the Amazon, things like that. That's really important too. Then we have the methane I mentioned before from agriculture and industry. There's a little bit of back and forth about how much is from agriculture, primarily cattle and rice fields, versus industry like fracking and natural gas pipelines. Depends who you talk to, but they're both really, really important. And then we have nitrous oxide that I mentioned before, primarily from fertilizer use in some industry. And then these so-called F gases or fluorinated gases, primarily those are being used as refrigerants right now in our air conditioners and refrigerators and freezers. So if those things leak out of your air conditioner, for example, and get into the atmosphere, they are hugely powerful per molecule pollutants, causing a lot of warming for a very small amount of gas. So we have to keep an eye on those too. So this is kind of what causes the problem, but how do we fix it? Well, here's to take a look at the atmosphere. Here, I'm just saying, showing the atmosphere is like a big container in the sky. Imagine it like just a big box. And we humans are adding pollution to that box. Instead of the chemical formulas, I've now kind of redrawn this to show you the sources by the economic activity of where greenhouse gases come from. These numbers are for the whole world. This isn't the United States or upstate New York or Minnesota where I am or anything like that. This is the entire planet. Region by region, it varies a lot. But globally, we see things like electricity and agriculture and industry, transportation, and so on are emitting these greenhouse gases. So that adds up on the left to 100% of our emissions. But the atmosphere doesn't sit still. The atmosphere participates in the chemistry and physics and even the biology of the entire planet. And it turns out that about 40% of the greenhouse gases we emit each year are removed by nature. This is not us. This is just nature doing this. Humans are talking about carbon removal. You'll hear a lot about that, but we've yet to achieve anything measurable in this graph so far. But on land, we have forest soaking up a fair amount of our greenhouse gases, primarily CO2, and we have coastal and ocean areas that also absorb CO2. And that leaves behind about 60% roughly of the greenhouse gases we emit each and every year, and that's what's building up year over year. But thank goodness, the environment, nature, forest and oceans primarily, are removing about 40% of our greenhouse gas pollution. If that weren't happening, climate change would be a lot worse already. So nature is giving us a little bit of breathing room, but now we have to figure out what to do with that. This diagram is probably the most important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about stopping climate change, because we have to work on the left and the right-hand side of this diagram. And to achieve drawdown, to stop climate change, we've got to do two big things. First, we've got to reduce the sources of pollution to zero, not just net zero, you hear that a lot, but just zero. We eventually have to bring these all to zero. Some of that's going to be very hard. Some of it won't be that hard. But over the coming decade or two, and maybe three, we're going to have to bring these all down to zero and kind of reimagine how we do things like make electricity, how we transport things around the world, how we farm, how we do industry, and all that will have to be kind of reinvented so they don't emit major sources of greenhouse gases. At the same time, we've got to support the right-hand side of the equation here and keep nature's sinks of forest and oceans healthy so they can continue to remove a little bit of that pollution and help stabilize it and maybe bring it down again. And if we're really lucky, maybe we can even add to what nature's doing, either by supplementing nature with other nature like trees or healthy farmland, or maybe with machines. So what we have to do is we have to work on the sources and the sinks, the things that remove carbon from the atmosphere. We've got to work on both sides of this equation if we're going to stop climate change. So as I walk through this, I want you to keep three principles in mind. First and foremost, to stop climate change, we've got to stop the pollution where it starts. Bring the pollution, the emissions to zero. And that's where we have to zoom into this part of the diagram a little bit. How do we stop emissions in these big areas? Well, we can do that and bring them to zero, but we're going to have to walk through them step by step and see what are the opportunities to do this and how can we do it starting now. Okay, well, if reducing the sources is key, then we've got to look at what causes them. Globally, electricity production causes about a quarter of the problem. A quarter of the greenhouse warming pollution basically comes from burning coal and natural gas to make electricity. Okay, we'll have to look at that. Another quarter globally, not in the US, but globally roughly, about a quarter of that is from the food system, mostly clearing forest or agricultural practices and so on. Basically all of our land use, agriculture, and the food system. That's kind of interesting. It turns out food is about equal to electricity at the global scale, not in the US though, but globally in terms of causing climate change. And the two together are about half the problem. That's kind of amazing. Then we have industrial sources, things like making steel and cement and other things. We have transportation, we have buildings. Buildings directly emit greenhouse gases themselves from furnaces, hot water heaters, boilers, leaking air conditioners, all that. But don't forget that buildings also consume some of the electricity that's over in that orange area, and they're made out of things developed in industry down in the blue. So it turns out the built environment, not just buildings themselves, buildings and their systems and what they're made of turn out to have a very big kind of greenhouse gas footprint. Then we have everything else, a lot of little things in here, including some things right from the energy industry itself. But I want you to focus on the other five for the moment, because electricity, food, industry, transportation, and buildings are 90% of climate change, just on one hand. That's a lot, and we can do a lot in those different areas. So in electricity, again, that's 25% of the problem. And it's also 25% of the greenhouse gases are caused by producing electricity, burning coal and natural gas, releasing CO2 to the air. So if we make electricity differently with solar and wind and hydro or nuclear or whatever, that can go down. But also, let's not forget how electricity is used, not just how it's produced, because we can cut down the amount of electricity we need, as well as changing the way we make it. This is like energy efficiency. So when we see how electricity is used, we can see how a lot of it's used in buildings and industry. So there might be opportunities for us to dramatically lower the demand for electricity, as well as how we supply it. Well, at Project Drawdown, we review hundreds of different ideas to stop climate change. We have a team of research scientists and scholars around the world who we bring on every year or so to go around and look at every published study on every possible solution that we're looking at. And then we go through a very formal process of assessing how big the solution can be, but also what it might take in terms of money, kind of financially, but also in terms of implementation and land and other things. And in this diagram, I'm showing some of the electricity solutions here with energy efficiency, and here in how we make electricity, kind of shifting from coal and gas to renewables and other low carbon sources. Each of those circles represents a single climate solution that we've been analyzing for a while now. The size of the circle is proportional to how big an impact it would have on climate change. So the bigger the circle, the bigger the solution. And some of those solutions have two circles, an inner one and an outer one with some shading. That just represents a range of numbers that we're looking at that we think are plausible, given how uncertain some of these numbers can be. So here we can see a lot of energy efficiency, like in buildings and like lighting and thermostats and control of buildings and so on, are really, really important. But also how we make the electricity in the first place, seeing that like large scale solar and wind is really important, but also so can be other kinds of sources here. And these are all going to be really crucial. So it's both a supply of electricity, but also how we demand electricity together are really important. In food, we also have a major source of climate change here, but we also have a lot of solutions. But it turns out the emissions of greenhouse gases from agriculture are primarily here. It turns out that a lot of the climate change problem from agriculture and food is in deforestation. That's the #1 source. It's like when we clear cut places like the Amazon or Indonesia to have more land for agriculture. That's a really big problem. Then #2 is methane emissions, primarily from animals, but also a little bit from rice. Methane is definitely being released by cattle and dairy operations and so on, but also other ruminant animals that burp methane. So how much meat and dairy we have and how we grow that is going to be very important. Third is nitrous oxide emissions, I mentioned before, coming from overusing fertilizers and manure and other things like that. Everything else in the food system is the remaining 5%. But the top three things, again, are deforestation, kind of meat and dairy operations and their methane emissions, and overusing fertilizers. Those are the kind of big ones. And the solutions are kind of interesting. Just like in electricity, we can be more efficient with food, as well as growing it differently. But with food, the efficiency numbers are even more important. So reducing food waste turns out to be a huge solution in this area, because 30 to 40% of all the food on Earth is never eaten. That's extraordinary. Think of that, 30 to 40% of all the food in the world is wasted post-harvest. That's incredible. And that means 30 to 40% of all the land, all the chemicals, all the water, all the greenhouse gases it took to grow the food weren't really necessary. So if we can address some of that food waste, that can help a lot. Also, we talk about plant-rich diets because meat and dairy disproportionately do emit methane, at least right now, the way most of that stuff is being grown. Turns out it doesn't always have to be grown that way, and we can do it better. But by taking some pressure off of meat and dairy and cutting back a little bit, at least, in countries where we eat a lot of meat and dairy products, and also where doctors are saying we might be better to tone that down a little bit, that's very important. We're not saying, by the way, that everybody should stop eating meat, because that wouldn't be responsible. There are some places in the world that depend on local pastoral systems for food security, and maybe in cultures that have been raising cattle for thousands of years in some parts of Africa and Asia and Australia, other places. And we need to be very mindful of that. But a more kind of plant-rich diet around the world, especially in places like the US, would probably be healthy for us and take some pressure off of our environment as well. But we need to kind of see a mixture there, not an absolute one or the other answer. We also need to protect the ecosystems, especially forest and forests that are on peatland soils that are really rich in carbon from being cleared. And then we can farm differently. We'll see farming again later in kind of our land sinks that we can create. But here, this is about reducing emissions. So you think about nutrient management, conservation tillage, regenerative systems, and so on, growing rice more efficiently. Later, we'll see agriculture kind of pop up again, not only reducing its pollution, but maybe acting like a bit of a sponge, absorbing some extra pollution by rebuilding soils and what's called regenerative agriculture, which is pretty exciting. Then we go to industry. I won't go through all this as much detail, but in industry, we're dealing with a lot of different things like making metal, especially steel, cement, chemicals, plastics, refrigerants that I mentioned before, processing all the world's waste and landfills and water treatment facilities. All of those kind of lot of complicated things show up in industry. We've been looking at a lot of different solutions in industry. We're now adding a whole nother round of those as I'm talking to you today. They'll be published later this year. But these are the ones we've looked at so far, showing that refrigerants, those chemicals we used in air conditioners and refrigerators and so on, are really important, as is cement and how we process waste and so on. These are going to be very, very important. Transportation is going to be a big issue too. Transportation is about 14% of climate change, but 10% of that 14 is from roads. So trucks, passenger vehicles, et cetera, are going to be really important here, both to be more fuel efficient with the current technology, but then electrify as much as we can, as quickly as we can, so we can move things around without burning fossil fuels. But also don't forget about alternative transportation, things like mass transit or video conferencing. I didn't have to fly to you to give this talk, and you didn't have to drive to the library to do this tonight. So things like Zoom might turn out to be helpful in reducing some emissions from transportation, which could be nice down the road too. We get to buildings. Buildings are directly, that is, their physical emissions from the buildings themselves are about 6%, but they're a big part of what happened in electricity and in industry. So built systems are really, really important. But even what happens in the building envelope itself is also critical. So residential buildings are about 2 to 1 more emitting than commercial and public buildings, but they're all really important. And we can build new green buildings that can be better. But for the next couple of decades, most of the buildings we're going to live in are already built. And so a lot of this will be about remodeling old buildings and making them far more energy efficient and also powered by non-carbon emitting greenhouse heating and cooling systems and power and so on. So those are ways we can reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, the kind of beginning of the problem. But we also have to support the sinks, the things that are kind of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. This is also sometimes called carbon removal, which we've heard a lot about in the media in the last few months. But right now, humans are not doing very much of this. We're talking about it a lot and playing around with it, but really it's nature. Nature is doing this already at the tune of 40% of all the pollution we put up there, and it's mostly forest and oceans. So protecting nature is the big story here, but then maybe being clever about how we could augment that through our practices would also be helpful. So on land, the biggest thing we can do here is protect forest around the world, especially in the tropics, in the boreal forests of Canada and Russia as well, and temperate forests. Keeping forests from being cleared in the first place would be really important. Then after that, planting more forest areas, restoring forests where and when it's appropriate. That also would be very helpful, but it's not a silver bullet. And then third, we can look at our working lands, our croplands, our pastures, our agricultural lands, which are vast areas of the planet, and practice what we call regenerative agriculture on those systems. So they start to put back some of the carbon that was once in the soil and in the trees and in the grasses that nature used to have before we plowed them all up or overgrazed them. So it's kind of a better generation of farming. This is still very, very small right now, and there's still a lot of questions about how big and how permanent those changes can be, but it looks very promising to at least be a partial solution on the table with many, many others. So not only protecting forests and replanting trees, but farming differently might be able to put carbon back into the land, both in our farms and in our forests. That'll be great. Oceans right now are doing this kind of on their own, but we humans can help oceans along. First, we can protect the coastal areas better, maybe even restore them, things like wetlands, mangroves, et cetera, that are really, really important for this, but also things like shellfish beds and coral reefs and other areas that can be very important parts of coastal and ocean ecosystems. That'll be pretty interesting. Some people are even talking about farming the ocean, like using kelp to absorb carbon into the ocean and then burying the kelp down in the deeper ocean, kind of like farming, the oceans to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. There's some pretty interesting ideas there, and we're starting to take a hard look at those in terms of how much carbon could they take up and how practical is this idea? Would it work, and how would we do it? Well, now we've talked about nature kind of on land and in the oceans and what we can do to help nature kind of remove greenhouse gases, but there are also machines that can do this as well. For the last 2 to 3 decades, we've actually been experimenting with machines, largely with big grants from the Department of Energy and big tax breaks, mostly to giant oil companies that have tried to remove carbon dioxide out of their smokestacks, basically. This used to be called like clean coal, was an idea that kicked around for a long time. But the technology developed for that, which never really worked very much, has now been kind of repurposed to say, could we build machines that are just sucking carbon out of the atmosphere and burying it below ground somewhere to just remove it chemically out of the atmosphere? A number of different companies are starting to do this, but at a very, very, very small scale. They would, on average, have to scale by about 1 million-fold to even be noticeable in the atmosphere. But someday down the road, we might be happy to have some machines like this to kind of help us get over the final threshold. But I don't see these making a big difference for at least 20 to 30 years. But down the road, we might be happy to have these. But right now, I plant trees. So we now have to move to a third principle. First, we stopped the pollution. Then we talked about supporting the sinks, like in nature, maybe with machines. I haven't mentioned this yet, but it turns out there are solutions to climate change that don't start off as climate solutions. They start off as things we should be doing anyway to help improve equality and equity and just human well-being around the world. For example, we've noticed around the world when women and girls have much more level kind of access to education and healthcare, a lot of important things start to change in society, unleashing a whole suite of interesting climate solutions. Also, when we see indigenous communities have better control over their own lands, especially forest, they tend to be more rich in biodiversity, they absorb more carbon, and they keep more carbon out of the atmosphere. So sometimes doing the right thing for people has a kind of a secondary effect of doing the right thing for climate, which is really kind of exciting. Seeing it, and we know that when bad things happen to climate, it hurts the poor and disproportionately people of color around the world more than others. But it turns out when we do things that are better for underrepresented groups in the future, it also can have a benefit back to climate as well. So we can see kind of virtuous benefits to both people and the planet if we think about it the right way. But let me put all this together because I've just walked through a whole lot of stuff. The big picture here is there's no silver bullet to stopping climate change at all. If you tell me I have the solution to climate change, no, you don't. Nobody does. We all have a little piece of the solutions we need to stop climate change. Nobody has the one. And it turns out we have to do a lot of different things. Like up here, we have to reduce sources in lots of different parts of the economy, doing lots of different things. These big circles, within each one of those are actually dozens of individual practices we have to do to even pull off one of those. We also have to do things with nature and supporting sinks on land and oceans and maybe with machines down the road, and also improving society and things like health and education. This is not even a complete list, but we already see all the different levers we have to pull simultaneously to address climate change and then change the future. But it turns out that with solutions we already have in place today, we can stop climate change. That's the good news. You'll hear people say, we don't have the technology to do this. That's not true. We actually do. Some of them are a little more expensive at first, but later I'll show you they all will save huge amounts of money in the long run. But it turns out that yes, we can change the future. If we don't do what we're showing here, this is the most likely outcome. We'll continue to increase CO2 and greenhouse gas levels into the atmosphere, making climate change worse. But we don't have to. We developed two scenarios using the solutions we've reviewed so far, showing that we can in fact stop climate change between the late 2040s into the early 2060s. That whole range of dates is all possible. Some of them are way more aggressive than others, but these are all still physically and economically possible. And if we did that, we would see the temperature of the world not go above like 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, what we call the Paris Accords. Right now, the world's about 1.1 degrees warmer than it should be. We can stop climate change at about 1.5 to 2 degrees, we believe. If we don't do anything, though, we're headed towards 3, 4, and maybe beyond, which would be a catastrophic impact to the planet. So we can stop climate change and maybe stay within the Paris Accords with tools we already have. So what have we learned so far? First of all, it is not too late. Don't write off the planet and tell us all it's hopeless, because it's not true. And people who say it's hopeless to stop climate change, you're not doing anybody any favors at all. You're actually helping the oil companies when people say stuff like that. It's just not true, and it paralyzes us with inaction. We can stop climate change, and we have enough to do it now to get started. As other technologies and other practices come along, we'll add them to the toolbox, believe me, and it will only get better. But right now, we do have enough tools right here, right now, to get the job done. And I think we'll add more as we go. And a really good thing is we can do it and make the world better as we go. We can have a more healthy, more prosperous, safer, more equitable world than we've ever had, while also addressing one of our biggest challenges. But to do this, it isn't enough to say we have the solutions. Now we have to go make them happen. We've got to implement them and scale them up into the world. To do that, we're going to have to do lots of different things. We're going to have to change policy and laws, the rules of which our society behaves. We're going to have to change money. We're going to have to pull billions and billions of dollars out of things like fossil fuels and bad agriculture, et cetera, into good things like renewables, regenerative agriculture, circular economies, and so on. There are going to be a lot of new jobs being created. And unfortunately, some jobs will transition and be lost. We'll have to help people during that process, like any other technology changes. We're going to have to demand better of our businesses, for sure, but we're also going to have to take some responsibility at our own personal and community level, although that burden isn't entirely on us at all, but we can help. And also we need to be wiser with our use of technology, not just the faraway Star Trek gadgets, but what technologies can we do right here, right now, that helps be innovation right today to stop the problem. So when I think about climate change, I kind of think of it like a giant chess game out into the future. How do we do the opening moves, and how do we play the entire board, as they say in chess? Well, if you think of it this way, a chessboard could look like this. On maybe the horizontal, we have all the solutions we need to climate change. And in the vertical, we have all the things we can do to make them scale, like setting big goals, changing policy, changing capital and jobs and behavior and technology investments. This, if you will, is the climate chessboard. And we've got to learn how to play the whole board. We can't win this game by only knowing how to move our bishop. We've got to play all the pieces on the entire board over 3 decades in order to pull this off, but we can. Let me wrap up really soon here and show you the roadmap of what's ahead and what we need to do. In order to keep the planet below like 1.5 or 2 degrees warmer than normal, to kind of stop climate change before it gets really terrible, we're going to have to dramatically cut greenhouse gas emissions and then slowly build up over the coming decades some carbon removal, which will be very hard. But first and foremost, we got to cut the pollution. So that's the big number one job. To do that, we're going to need some really big quick wins like right now in the early 2020s. Things that can dramatically cut emissions very, very quickly, like energy efficiency, really vast scale renewables, food waste, stopping deforestation, capping methane leaks that are just obvious leaks that we can stop right now. That would help a lot. We also have a huge infrastructure challenge ahead of us. We're going to have to replace like everything with new technologies. Every furnace, every hot water heater, every air conditioner, every car, every internal combustion engine, everything will be updated in the coming decade or two. That's an enormous job with billions and billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of jobs also hopefully being created along the way. It's going to take years to do this. So we better start now, but realize it's going to take time to finish it all off. And then in the meantime, we can also be doing things like planting the trees that eventually grow up in the coming decades, absorbing a little carbon, farming better, building up the soils, but that's going to take time and build up in the future. And we'll be glad we did in the 2040s when that starts to pay off. And then also technologies that now are still in the laboratory or maybe pilot scale, we need years to help mature those, sort out which ones really work, because 99% of them probably will fail. We're going to have to see who the real winners are and deploy those starting out in the next few decades. But that also means starting today. So we need to have the quick wins today, but start infrastructure today, start restoring nature today, and start the R&D today. All of those things start now. They just extend in different waves out into the future. And I get to think of this as like an incredible opportunity. Solving climate change isn't just a problem, it's an opportunity to kind of do everything better. Everything we could do to solve climate change is building a better world. We get to reimagine how we farm, how we use industry, how we get around, how we live. And all of those could be done in better ways that are safer, more economical, more equitable, more just, and just better for health, the economy, and for everybody. We get to build a better world, not one from the 19th century, but a 21st century world, and get to redo a lot of things. But we also need a lot more kind of visionary leadership to get us there. One of the great leaders of our century past was Martin Luther King, who didn't tell people that they were bad or evil. He just said, or tell us that the world was going to hell in the handbasket. He talked about a dream he had of a better world out in the future. He said, a better world is possible. I have a dream about it, let me tell you. And then he invited all of us, Black and brown and white and all of us, to join together in achieving that dream. Now, he died for that dream, and we've definitely not achieved it completely yet. We're still on the beginning steps of that dream. But I think we need a climate dream too, where we say, hey, we can still imagine a better world where we and our children and our descendants can live with nature together sustainably into the future and live a good life. So in wrapping up, I'd like to ask you a few things. First and foremost, we all need to learn and share more with all of these issues. Nobody knows all the answers or all the issues. We're going to have to really work together and learn and share a lot as we go forward. We also need leadership everywhere, not just in Washington. We've got some there now, which is great, but we need it everywhere. And not just the elected folks, every folk. We need people in schools and churches and synagogues and businesses, community centers, libraries, everywhere to be exercising your leadership and helping us move to a better world. Everything matters now, and all of us matter now. And also remember that the future is not written yet. You can help write it. And I'd like to help you, ask you to help in that process and remind you that the future is still up for grabs. As Robert Wilson likes to say, the future belongs to any and all of us who will take the risk and accept the responsibility of consciously creating the future they want. So with that, I'll wrap up and just point out that if you want to get some more resources about climate solutions or learn anything about this kind of work, please come see us at drawdown.org or follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Project Drawdown, very easy to find. We also, I should mention, we have a free online course at drawdown.org called Climate Solutions 101. It's very easy. It's like 6 little units, about 20 minutes each, as kind of the backbone of the course, plus discussions with another 10 experts around the world that go a little longer, and plus a whole bunch of free readings and graphics and videos and things like that, all free of charge and all very accessible, I hope, to most folks, whether you're a teacher or just interested in this kind of topic. Please go check it out. So with that, I'll stop and let's shift over to some questions and answers, I think, and see what we got in mind today.
Yes, thank you. So good evening, everyone. My name is Tammy Thornton. I'm the president of Wilton Go Green, and I just want to again thank Dr. Jonathan Foley. Thanks to our Green Speaker Series headed up by Rena and Serby and Brian, and also to Michael and the Wilton Library. So we do have a bunch of questions in our question and answer, so I'm going to get to those, but I also want to, for those people that like to hold things, there's the original Drawdown text, which I love. It's like kind of my coffee table book, which talks a lot about all these different things. But then there's also the Drawdown Review, which is the updated version, which you can get right on the Drawdown website as well, and read it from there. So those are also some really great resources to
This
help.
one's free, so. And
That's true. That one's free. This one was a gift. But which is great. And so, and for those that don't know Wilton Go Green, like a lot of what Dr. Foley is talking about has kind of been our mission about do one thing. Like, what is your one action that you could start to do that can make a difference and can exercise your leadership with your family, with your friends, learning something new and sharing. And so let's just get up to our questions up here. So question one was, what happens with the ideas you come up with at Project Drawdown? Like, so how likely is it that you get companies to use them, the government to use them? You know, have you seen kind of higher ups take your information and do something with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's kind of the focus of what we're calling now Drawdown 2.0. The first iteration was just seeing, is it even possible to stop climate change with the tools we have? Believe it or not, that original book, nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had really stacked up all the different climate solutions across all those different parts of the economy and said, is it enough? I don't know. Nobody had really done that. And then we did that. And instead of writing a big kind of science volume, we wrote a coffee table book. So we tried to make it as accessible as possible. And I've been delighted and surprised how often that book kind of shows up in people's conversations. So it's had a very strange and powerful impact that we weren't always knowing about, that we maybe didn't always intend. It shows up in a lot of different conversations, which has been fantastic. In Drawdown 2.0, and I've only been with the organization about 2 years. I was not there for the original book. I came in afterward to kind of reboot the thing to a 2.0 level. We want to reach a much bigger audience of the broader kind of lay public, especially people who haven't thought about climate very much. I think, you know, reaching the environmental community, great, good, but that's the choir. We got to reach everybody beyond the choir too. And talking about solutions and talking about how it helps like create jobs or helps be healthier and more economical and more equitable communities, that gets a lot more people on our team. So we're going to be kind of pivoting our communication to be a little bit more focused on these kind of so-called co-benefits to climate solutions. It's not just good for the atmosphere and the planet, it's good for you. It's good for all of us. This is good stuff. So we're hoping the kind of broader reach will be like a 10 to 100-fold increase in kind of the message that, hey, climate solutions are real, they're possible, and they're good for us. This is great. And hopefully that'll enable a lot of these transitions to be better when people can imagine and see that those solutions work. But then we have another effort that's targeting very specific groups of pretty influential folks. What we've decided to do is we're focusing on business leaders, philanthropists, kind of major donors, investors, and community leaders. We have decided not to focus in Washington, D.C. because, well, everybody else is. We don't need yet another environmental NGO headquartered in Washington. They got like hundreds of them. So we're going out to communities instead around the country, around the world, and saying, you know, Joe Biden can talk about climate solutions and set goals and throw a lot of money at stuff, but at the end of the day, that solar farm is going to be in your town, or that windmill is going to be over there. And so the steel in the ground kind of solutions are often held up at the local level by things like zoning boards or community feedback or like a public utilities commission, things like that. And we got to pay attention to local decision-making everywhere to kind of get the job done. So that's what we're trying to do there, but also with leading businesses to help them not only be making kind of mild commitments like, oh, by 2040 or 2050, somewhere way the hell out there, we'll be carbon neutral, whatever that means. We're saying, no, do bigger than that, faster than that, and more accountable than that right now. And we've got some very large leading companies starting to step up on that, including likes of Google, General Mills, Netflix, other companies like that who say, yeah, we're all in on this, which is pretty exciting. Plus investors and philanthropists. So that's kind of our theory of change, like go bigger in the public sphere beyond the environmental community, but then dive deep with some very, very targeted groups that we think are going to be part of that bigger climate chessboard that I mentioned before. But we're still a small organization, and so we have to really be good about partnering with everybody to do more with less. You know, we've all got to figure out how to be more efficient and get more done more quickly than ever before. So we're really eager to partner too.
That's great. I think that's a great answer that covered a lot of other questions too. But someone did also ask just your opinion of the Biden climate plan and the likelihood that other, countries like China and Brazil will make those sufficient concessions for that, shift on emissions.
This is not a partisan statement. I'm going to not, talk about his particular political party or whatever, but Biden has been amazing on climate issues. I cannot believe the quality and thoughtfulness of his approach. From, I'd have to say, in the early campaign days, his kind of climate plans were pretty lukewarm at first, but this is a guy who actually listens to scientists, to his peers, and to others. He thinks really hard about things, and he admits what he doesn't know, which is kind of a refreshing change in our president. And he's actually been very ambitious on this stuff in ways that we've never seen before. The US did peak our greenhouse gas emissions back in 2007. And then the Obama-Biden administration oversaw a time where we've actually reduced our emissions by about 15%. But we got to do at least 50 by the end of this decade beyond that. And I think he's going to get this done. And I've never seen such a deep commitment from Washington, but also from the business world. I mean, businesses now see the writing on the wall. Even the oil industry is kind of like, okay, time's up. We've got to do this. So I'm actually pretty optimistic that something might start to move. Now, a lot of us have been waiting for this for 30 years and a little frustrated. But the US is 15% of global emissions. China's much more. We have to see what China's doing. They are committing to being net zero by 2050 or so. They can do things really rapidly. The Europeans are. Brazil, we'll see. That's going to be very important. But the current president of Brazil is not a good environmental friend right now, I'd say. Canada just made a really impressive climate commitment, and it's a lot harder for them to do that than for the US, given some of their industry mixes. So I think we're starting to see some movement, but it's coming pretty late in the game. But we're kind of in the fourth quarter of the game, but we got a lot of yards to make up. But maybe we can pull it off. That's kind of where we are. But the quality of the people working around Biden on climate and energy issues has never been better. I've never seen such good expertise in federal government and science or the environment ever before. It's extraordinary.
That's great. Thank you. So the next question was, some Scandinavian countries have achieved carbon neutrality with widespread adoption of nuclear energy. Germany reduced its production of nuclear energy and ended up increasing coal-based electricity generation. So why isn't nuclear power a quick win?
Well, nuclear, let's set aside the issues, which we can't, but let's, for the moment, set aside the other concerns with nuclear about, like, what do you do with the waste and how safe are these things and all that. Let's table that for the moment. The real big problem with nuclear is that in this country, the last nuclear power plant to be built was like in the late 80s. And there have been several that went under construction and so on. They've all failed. They all went bankrupt. No public investor will put money into them because they feel like it's going to get stranded. This is the only energy technology in history that got more expensive over time. And you can't blame environmentalists for this. It was just pork and bloated budgets and bad companies and bad engineering. It's just a terrible business investment. And no one in Europe, no one in the United States is seriously talking about building nuclear again. And that's before the public backlash of building these kinds of things. These are big, huge, multi-billion-dollar boondoggle things that have only gotten longer and more delayed and more expensive. So just on the practicality, can you build a nuclear power plant in this country in less than 30 years? We haven't for the last 30 years, so I don't think we're going to. And so there's no quick anything with nuclear, with the exception of maybe China and Russia, but the Russian track record on nuclear isn't so hot, is pretty good. The real question in the US, though, and Europe is not about building new nuclear, because we're not going to, period. It's not going to happen. Nobody really thinks that's going to happen. It's whether or not we close the existing facilities and, or, can we keep them open longer and safely? That's the big debate. California is about to close their the last nuclear power plant in California. And sadly, right, for at least the short term, it will be replaced with natural gas for a while until renewables can make up that difference. So and nuclear is a complicated story here. It is definitely good for climate in the short run. But long-term, I don't think it's going to be a big solution just because of the incredible cost, political and social opposition, and so on. So even if it's a great technology, it's just not going to show up in time. There's a lot of talk, but there has been for decades of smaller, more modular reactors, and let alone fusion. And the joke is, advanced nuclear 20 years from now and always will be. It seems to always be 20 years away since the 1980s when I first started hearing about it. So I'm not really holding my breath on nuclear, but I would be careful about shutting down existing nuclear and really have a hard conversation about that.
All right, so I have two more questions as we're almost coming to the top of the hour. What is the best new technologies that you have seen or heard that heat and cool your home?
Heat pumps. That's the big story. Solar, wind, LED lighting, and batteries are the most exciting technologies of the last 5 years, 10 years. That's been amazing. The next one will be heat pumps. The getting rid of boilers and furnaces and existing air conditioners with what are called air source or ground source, but air source are cheaper and work even in cold climates really well. Air source heat pumps, Mitsubishi and other companies pioneered some incredible devices like this. If we can get those to be cheaper than a traditional furnace and air conditioner for American homes, you just had a huge win. It runs completely on electricity, can be run with renewables very effectively and work in every climate in the country now, at least if your buildings are well built. A lot of people ask me like, hey, what should Jeff Bezos do with the $10 billion he's committed to climate change? I said, buy everybody in America a heat pump and have Amazon deliver and install it for free. You would change the industry forever. I mean, don't give it to a bunch of nonprofits or whatever. Go out and buy a bunch of stuff and change the market forever, because those would suddenly get cheaper than regular furnaces. And that would be amazing. But let's start with our public buildings like schools, hospitals, things like that. I'd love to see governments invest in that kind of technology and get it to be cheaper. And when policy drives things to get cheaper, we all have these things now because they're better and cheaper. When markets work and help environmental problems like that, that's a good day. So I think heat pumps are the big exciting thing.
That's great, because I know some folks were looking to install them here, so I think that made that decision right there.
Well, they're kind of hard though, because a lot of heating and cooling contractors don't have much experience with them yet, and they do cost a little more, and they're a little wary about recommending something they haven't done for the last 20 years and stuff. But that's the future, and the more people get them installed and buy them and talk about them, the more that will snowball and become the de facto everything. It's like electric vehicles, but for homes.
Right. So I guess to sum this all up, because you've talked a lot about kind of solutions and you've mentioned lots of different little solutions throughout your whole presentation, but what's that one action or the couple top things as a residential homeowner person of average, that could do right now that isn't maybe going to cost them anything, or that can cost a little bit of something, but just what are your big, like, do it now, start tomorrow, start as soon as you get off the computer?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the bigger things are recognize that, we are all voters. We are all citizens or, are participants in a democracy. So do that well with climate in mind. So participate in local issues and voting and all these kinds of things with that in mind would be the most helpful. Learning and sharing of this issue with everybody. Even those climate skeptics we all meet on Thanksgiving dinner, or whatever. But maybe instead of talking about whether climate change is real, talk about the solutions and how they can create jobs and help empower like rural communities and bring them back to thriving again, things like that. That would be great. Or help communities that have been left behind far too many times in the past. That would be great. But then as kind of consumers and homeowners and participants in the regular daily life, food waste. There's one, saves you money right there, helps not only climate change, but also land use and biodiversity and water, wasting less food. Our grandparents were really good at this. They put food by, they did preserve things, they canned things, they were good about leftovers. Maybe we should get better at that too. Also, smaller portions, lighter meals, probably our doctors would be happy if we did that too as well. So I'd say that's kind of a good one. Others are the next time you need to replace something in your home, like, the next time the light bulb burns out, get the more efficient one, of course. Or the next time your furnace conks out, maybe think about a more efficient one, or maybe go to the heat pump. Same thing with a car. Don't go out and spend money you don't have, that kind of thing. But in the natural cycle of your life and making big decisions and big purchases, efficiency and renewable types of things are really going to be helpful. But do it as we can and get there, and that'll all help out a lot.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think one of our major topics last month was also about reducing food waste and how easy that is for everybody to do. And we can talk more about that if you want to, with folks who want to reach out to us. So,
Can I mention one thing on that? Also, don't just think about your home. Pressure things like, when we all go back to work someday, things like work events, like I now require at any event that I have for work that there also be provided by a caterer, like little take-home boxes, like those little like Chinese food boxes and stuff that everybody can take some food home from a big event. Those are great things to have, by the way, at your home. Like if you have a party and you want to send food home, get those little paper boxes. They're really cheap, out of recycled paper. You don't need Tupperware all over the place. You just send home stuff. But schools also, how do we reduce food waste in schools? Universities, places of worship, library, whatever, anywhere where you, cafeterias at work, hospitals, things like that. You might have a bigger influence there than you do with just your own home. So just think about how you can tip things, not just in your own personal life, but as a participant in things around your town. That could be really important too. So sorry about that, but just thought I'd throw it.
But that's important too. And there are a lot of school districts looking at those kind of components too, but talking to those businesses in town as well, and those other areas, which is great. So I just want to, again, on behalf of all of Wilton Go Green and our Green Speaker Committee as well, thank you so much for joining us and zooming into Wilton tonight and Connecticut and all of these other towns that folks are joining us. And again, we have been recording this and we will share with some follow-up and some links and a little bit from the Q&A as well in a follow-up email. So again, thank you so much. And everyone should continue to follow Project Drawdown and your work. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. Have a good night.